could be it.
Grantees of the Gates Foundation. Nice, okay. Out of the room, please. And how many of you would like to be grantees?
That's what I was wondering.
So, Jeff, welcome.
Right. Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I'll just give a little intro about you, and maybe the longer than hellish.
Okay. Then we'll tell the truth.
Then we'll straighten it out. Jeff is about in his early 50s, right?
52.
He spent 27 years at Microsoft, so pretty much was one of the earliest employees there. And at the time, one of the youngest on wisdom. Moved to the Gates Foundation about 2.5 years ago. So you've been through at least 2 budget cycles and seen lots happen. Jeff and his wife, who's here, and his daughter, who is taking a tour of East Campus, have their own foundation. So they, on their own, contribute to make the world better. It's focused, if I remember right, on adolescents, both in-school activities and out of school. To flip for a second to the Gates Foundation, just to give a context for that, we're talking about the biggest foundation in the world. Certainly the biggest active one now. Its endowment is more than $37 billion, and correct me if I'm wrong. It will make grants more than $3 billion this year. Has 3 main program areas: health, global health, global development, and then there's a United States program as well. So this is sort of a backdrop to an immensely unusual story. And you add on to that really Melinda Gates, who had their father, who early on started giving money away and have continued to do so in greater and greater amounts and with greater significance. And in 2006, Warren Buffett joined with the Gates family and committed essentially a portion of the Berkshire Hathaway stock to the foundation on an annual basis, giving a certain amount of each time, which told me virtually doubled the payout that the foundation would be making every year. So with the combination of the Gates family money and Warren Buffett's money, this is, if you will, the powerhouse foundation of the United States and of the world. So that's my background, and anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'd like to lower expectations. No, I very much appreciate the introduction, and again, we really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm a proud native of the state of Nebraska. Just to add that in real quickly, my family are farmers, and I don't know if you understand Midwestern culture, but the way these things work is I had an older brother, he ran the farm, so I had to find another job. And I thought I was going to go work for the USDA in agricultural policy, but bought a computer to help my brother in running the farm and ended up going to work for a startup hardware company in Cupertino, California, named after a fruit. And spent about almost a year and a half there when I realized that if you really want to do great software, you got to go work for a software company. Hardware companies think of software as a sort of a sideline. And so I went to Microsoft in 1981 to help create what I hope most of you use, Microsoft Office. So most of my career was around a passion for information work. I just thought spreadsheets and word processors and presentation, graphics and database were just really cool stuff. So I guess that probably makes me a geek or a wonk or something like that. And but along the way, I learned a number of things about business and leadership, and also got a lot of great influence from people like Warren Buffett. Trish and I had the opportunity probably in the early 90s to hear his thoughts on philanthropy and the importance of respecting what your position is in society as a whole and what the contributions should be, both from a business standpoint and from a personal and philanthropic standpoint. And so I would say it was in the early 90s that Trish and I began to think about what our long-term future would be relative to philanthropy. And we got the Raikes Foundation going, I don't know what, maybe 5-7 years ago in that range. And today the Raikes Foundation is about $120 million endowment. By the time we get to where we'd like to be, it'll probably be about $400 to $500 million. So I have some benefit of seeing what it's like to start up a foundation and what it's like to lead a large foundation.
Well, both will be big players, $400 million foundations at the time. So we'll see. Let me start off my questions, something based on pure curiosity. Here you are, kind of like a lifer in the IT world and in Microsoft. You, except for a brief time at that fruit company, you don't have other work to be done that you have done, and somehow you get an offer to become head of the Gates Foundation. How did that happen, and what were your motivations for saying what you said?
Well, the key thing is that I think I believe in working. I believe in that there's a lot of great satisfaction that comes from one's endeavors, and so I had predicted probably around 2000 that Microsoft was going to get to a point where the next generation of leaders really need to lead, and I knew that I needed to embark upon a second career at some point in time, and so I made the decision to retire from Microsoft before I knew exactly what I was going to do. And I thought I might work in agriculture. In particular, I was interested in the idea of agricultural investment. I thought maybe I'd do some business school teaching. And I thought maybe I'd get more actively involved in philanthropy, either perhaps consulting with the Gates Foundation on their agricultural work, which was growing at that point in time, the work that Tricia was doing with the Raikes Foundation. But coincidentally, Patty Stonecipher, my predecessor, announced her retirement from the Gates Foundation about 2 months after I'd made my decision to leave Microsoft. And so one thing led to another, and here I am today.
So did the call come and say, we want you?
No, it didn't in that form, and I think that's exactly appropriate. I think the responsibility of the Gates Foundation and what it needs to do for society is very large, and I think it's very important that Bill and Melinda figure out who is the right leader of the foundation. And I think you could have picked other great leaders for the foundation. I think the thing that probably differentiated me is their knowledge of me, their trust in my approach and how I think about things, and my commitment to philanthropy and doing it at this kind of scale. And I think I got a good reference from Tom Tierney too, so that helped out.
Keep going, Tom. So let's take it another step. So you walk into Microsoft, into the foundation. Something you were not deeply vested in. What was the biggest surprise that you found? Well, what were the two? Something that really surprised you positively, and was there anything that surprised you negatively?
Well, there were a number of things. So it was announced in May of 2008 that I would take on the responsibility of leading the foundation in September of 2008. So I had a little bit of a period of time there where I was still finishing up my work at Microsoft and preparing to go to the Gates Foundation. And I'm a very curious person. I like to ask questions, and so I'd ask a lot of people. I said, well, what do you think is going to be important for me to know about the move from the private sector to philanthropy? Well, you just have to understand it's very different. Okay. And I'd ask somebody else, and they'd say, well, what should I know? And says, oh, you have to understand, it's very different. And so I kept asking, and I kept being told, well, it's very different. You have to think differently. It's very different. You have to think differently. And I think probably what had happened in the spectrum of the pendulum is the pendulum had swung over to here, where I expected, wow, everything's going to be so different. And so perhaps my first surprise was, well, it wasn't really as different as I thought it would be, but you have to calibrate that to some extent. And there clearly are differences, but on the other hand, you can think about some of my experiences at Microsoft or in high tech and how that applied, or what may be applicable. I started at Microsoft when we had 100 employees, and I left when we had 91,000. My last job at Microsoft as president of the business division, I had 17,000 employees overseeing quite a range of businesses, the Microsoft Office business, et cetera. And so throughout those 27 years, I had seen what happens when you have high growth and then you need to kind of step back and maybe retrench and maybe even sometimes shrink an area and grow an area. So I had some experiences like that I think were very helpful to me in those first few months. The foundation had tripled in size in the 3 years before I started. And so in some respects, I would describe the Gates Foundation as a bit of a, when I was entering, a bit of a mid-sized startup organization. It had all of the common things that you see in terms of fast growth, lack of some key processes and structures, and so there was, frankly, some fixing that was part of the role as I came in, and I perhaps underestimated some of that because Patty and the leadership team, terrific people, and it wasn't that they had done anything wrong. It was just simply that there had been a lot of growth, and I needed to really help the organization deal with that. Second big surprise that occurred was the global economic crisis. That really was hitting within my first few days at the foundation. But frankly, and I saw this a lot in high tech, when you have something like that, kind of a big shock to the system, it's as much an opportunity as it is an issue, because in some respects it gave me a way to ring the alarm bell on some of the things that I think we really needed to change. And it gave me sort of the air cover, if you will, to do that. I think that's harder in philanthropy than it is in the private sector. Why? Well, this goes to this issue of there's no sort of market signals in the same way in philanthropy as you see in the private sector. And so the global economic crisis gave me at least some of the air cover to make begin making the changes that I think we needed to undertake, and that was very helpful, frankly.
Mm-hmm. So let me just pursue this track one more step, which is from when you came to now, I suspect the size of the place has grown by 50 or 100%.
Yeah, it's we were about 750 when I started, and we're about 925 now, so not even 50% growth.
Okay. At the same time, to compare that scale to any other foundation in America there's just no comparison. Ford might be 250.
No, they're actually about 500 people for it. Which is an interesting comparison point. Is that if Ford's at 400 or 500 people, and they're, I don't know what they would probably be paying out 750, 800 million a year. We're about 900. We're trying to pay out about 3.5 billion. Then it leads to one of my biggest concerns is what is the appropriate resource strategy in philanthropy?
And the size of the portfolio.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the things in sort of looking at the background of the foundation and so on, you sent a few documents over for me to look at, and the attention to detail and the fine-grained nature of the intellectual work and strategic planning, thinking through it, replanning, and there's even a section for insight, which is collected within the organization and then shared, I believe, internally and so forth. This very detailed and methodical approach to getting the job done, it would seem to me, runs quite counter to the world that you've chosen to work in underdeveloped countries, largely with not very good communication systems and other systems as well. And how does an organization that is really heavily into thinking things through, lots of brain power, lots of figuring it out, get on the ground and play the game on the ground in countries that really are fairly, in some ways, primitive, but not well developed economically? How do you train your employees? How do you get people to work under those circumstances where there isn't just a complete mismatch of being good?
Well, first of all of those things that you referenced about where we'd written down our strategy, refresh, and development process and review process, you have to remember that's all theoretical.
Right.
You know, then there's the practical in the day-to-day, and I wouldn't yet give us high marks at how we execute relative to the things that you saw written down. We are kind of an awkward teenager, really, and so I think part of what we have to do is we have to develop the muscles that give us the capacity for impact, and that has to be part of our ongoing work. That has to be fundamental to underlying the programmatic work that we're doing, because it increases our ability to have that impact, or our capacity for impact. But relative to your I think what you were really driving at is the question of it's a wild and woolly world out there. Things change, and but that's also true in the private sector. I mean, our CFO when I came in, Alex Friedman, terrifically smart guy. He worked for a period of time at the White House as a White House fellow underneath a general, and he liked to say, or quote the general as having said, that no battle strategy and plan survives first point of contact with the enemy. And so I learned that in business as well. I learned that when we got started on what ultimately became Microsoft Office back in 1982. The strategy we had seemed like a great strategy. It did not survive first point of contact with the enemy. We really had to rethink. And that is part of what is required for excellence in philanthropy, especially the style of philanthropy that we do. You have to really think of it as a process of continuous learning. It's harder because you don't have some of the same types of signaling mechanisms that you get in the private sector, but still you have to think of it as continuous learning. That's the beauty of the market system in capitalism, is that if you're going to be successful, you're going to learn how to continuously gather insight from the marketplace and improve the work that you do. Otherwise, you go out of business. And I don't want to overdo the business private sector analogies to philanthropy, but I think there are a number of people here who've been very involved in business and understand that, and it's part of my background of where I came from. And so I do think a lot about how do you create sort of those proxies for continuous learning that drive success in a marketplace. How do you do that within philanthropy? And a key part of that is to have the right kind of measurement plans in place and to have a culture of continuous learning.
And in the private sector, if you put out a piece of software on Monday, and by Thursday it was moving off the shelf, by the next Monday there'll be another product sitting on the shelf. We don't generally have, it is different in the social sector, where we don't have that capacity to move as quickly, as targeted, as would presumably be in the private sector. So you're now working in Africa, working in tuberculosis, AIDS, all of the questions that are mammoth and complicated in lots of different ways. Very different from moving products on and off shelves. And I'm not in any way denigrating
No, I
Um,
understand.
So you got to find people both on the ground there and here that gets that way of acting and then can act from it.
Mhm.
Is there any kind of person you look for, any kind of employee, any people out there, contractors you work with, that gets this mix of the two?
Well, it's like many, probably any great organization of size, you're going to have a range of skills. And so, to some extent, what we need in our HIV work is, because our HIV work is largely focused in on prevention, we need people who really understand the science that underlies advanced retroviral concepts. On the other hand, there's a big portion of our HIV prevention work that's as basic as making sure that you have high usage of condoms or other techniques. One of the ones I learned about when I first came in is adult male circumcision. Reduces the likelihood of an HIV infection by 50 to 70%. And so then how do you really make sure that those programs are scaled up and effectively used? And so we need a portfolio of people who have a range of skills. Take, for example, our work in vaccines. Vaccines, in our opinion, are perhaps the best investment that you can make in trying to improve the lives of children in the developing world. And so we know that the way in which we're going to succeed is to make sure that a lot more kids have access to the vaccines that your kids have access to. Because our kids in the rich world don't die of rotavirus, which causes diarrhea. But in the developing world, it kills 500,000 kids a year. So we need to figure out how to make sure that those vaccines get delivered and that they get funded and that the costs come down. So I need people who are really trying to understand what can we do to get the pharmaceutical manufacturers to bring down the costs of those vaccines. We need people who are experts in telling that story so that governments, rich world governments, maintain their commitment or increase their commitment to funding Gavi, which is the primary multilateral organization for funding vaccines for kids. We need people who can meet with the Minister of Health in India and make sure that they stick to or increase their commitment to vaccines. And so you need a range of expertise in the organization. And back to something you said earlier, I actually would like to see the foundation be about 50% greater in employment than it was when I started. We're just having a hard time finding the expertise that we need, and to some extent getting them to move to Seattle, Washington. It's kind of nice here.
So, is it fair to ask then, does the Gates Foundation have a foreign policy?
Yeah, that's something that's really come up in the last year. I don't think that, I can see why some people would bring up that as a metaphor or an analogy, but I don't think so really. I wouldn't say that we have a foreign policy. Foreign policy really implies that you're trying to represent some national interest. And so, if the Gates Foundation has a foreign policy, you think, well, we're tied to the United States and we are trying to help develop the relationships with other governments, foreign governments, in order to be able to improve the national security interest or the economic opportunity of the United States. Not at all. That is not what we're about. We are about those poor kids in sub-Saharan Africa who are dying of diseases that could be prevented. And so if we have a citizenry, it is those kids. That's who we have to care about. And so I don't really think of it as a foreign policy. What I think of it is we have to have a deep understanding of who our constituents are, who our beneficiaries are, and we have to make sure that we appropriately poll the levers of using advocacy and voice in order to shine a spotlight on these issues. Now, it is interesting. I'll give you one anecdote that caught my attention. Trish and I were in Uganda and Ethiopia in December on Gates Foundation work. And we had our last night in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. We had dinner with a set of development leaders in the country. So the head of the equivalent of USAID from England, or from the UK, DFID, Department for International Development, and from the Netherlands, and from Germany, and from the World Bank. And the thing that really caught my attention was when they told us how important they thought the Gates Foundation work was to influence the government of Ethiopia to do the right things relative to agricultural development or to public health. Now, keep in mind that our actual financial expenditure in Ethiopia is far dwarfed by all of that international aid money that comes in through those organizations. And even when you say that the Gates Foundation is the largest foundation or philanthropy in the world, the truth is we are a tiny percentage of the overall need on the issues that we're working on. So we have to think in very catalytic ways in order to get things done. And what really surprised me was listening to these development experts try and impress upon myself and my Gates Foundation colleagues how much they wanted us to be able to go in and influence the right things to happen in the Ethiopian government. And frankly, how challenging they felt it was because they are instruments of foreign policy. We are viewed as more credible that certainly was their perception. We're viewed as more credible in advising the Ethiopian government than their organizations, because their organizations always have their nationalistic interests that they're trying to promote. And so I do think there's some interesting things here, Ed, in terms of how to think about our role, but I don't think of it as foreign policy.
I would just tease it one more step out. Many of the governments and provincial governments as well as national governments, certainly some of them would be regarded as weak. They change more frequently than one would hope, some of them. And therefore the question of risk really comes up high. You may find an opportunity where there really are issues of measles, retrovirus questions, and so on, diarrhea, and yet government is able to sustain what you need or maintain what you need. What happens when that happens?
That is a very challenging problem, but there are some things that we can do to insulate ourselves a little bit from that, and then there's some things where we just have to accept that that's the way it is. Let me introduce a little taxonomy here. First of all, I'm going to talk about horizontal interventions. So getting low-cost rotavirus and low-cost pneumonia vaccines available, that is horizontal. I hope that the Indian government gets it and decides that what they can do is save a lot of their kids by doing it, and we are subject to those political whims, but at the end of the day, there's a low-cost, if we get low-cost vaccines available, I hope it gets used in India, but maybe not in India, maybe it's in Nigeria, or maybe it's in Ethiopia, or maybe it's in Zimbabwe, so on and so forth. So the fact that we focus on things that are horizontal, they may get immediate take-up in some of the larger quote-unquote target markets, or it may be delayed due to those issues on the ground, but they will get used somewhere. That is something that I am absolutely confident on. On the other hand, there are certain things that we do that really are very dependent on actual delivery in the field. See, a lot of our work is more on the science and technology and system side, which is different than specific country, in-country programs. And so, if we're working on agricultural development in Ethiopia, and it's very specific to Ethiopia, we are subject to the Ethiopian government's continued commitment. We do have an incredible asset in the voice of Melinda and Bill. You know, the work that is underway in Ethiopia is due to, I think it actually started with a meeting that Melinda had with the Prime Minister Meles Zenawi a couple of years ago, and where he asked Melinda if the foundation would help advise them on their agricultural extension service, and they liked our advice, and so then they said, well, would you put together a transformational plan? And so they liked that advice, and now the person at the Gates Foundation, who we really like, Khalid Bama, will be running that transformational. He's leading the foundation to run that for the Ethiopian government. And now, if there's a political change there, it's certainly possible that that work will get stalled or postponed. So some of what we can do is insulated, and some of what we do is very dependent. Fortunately for us, a very large percentage of what we do is horizontal, at least in the global health and global development areas.
And is it a good third or so is working on vaccines and getting them done?
Yeah, that's always interesting. You could say, yeah, you could say a third.
So to still, I want to, because I think that this is providing us a very important picture, the pulls and tugs of what you have to go through. Now we have a case, I think, if my number is right, something over 30 million people are alive with AIDS in Africa. A fair number are getting various medication cocktails and so forth that have been provided by big pharma, small pharma, whatever. One of the results of that is that people are living longer than they would have lived before. So it turns a grave and life-killing disease into a chronic ailment if the person keeps medicine. Does the question come up at all that what in fact by doing this heroic piece of work, that the numbers of people who need continuous medication and attention continue to grow, so that it will, almost as a matter of course, yank money away from other areas, because by saving them, you vastly increase the budget for that as opposed to taking care of TB or something else.
Well,
it's always going to keep on growing.
Well, the answer to that on HIV, I wouldn't agree with that statement. But so I wouldn't have framed it quite the way you did, but I think you raised a very important point, which is what are the mechanisms for thinking through how health dollars get allocated or health resources get allocated, and it's an extremely important issue. We know that you cannot treat yourself out of this epidemic. Meaning, just by giving people low-cost ARVs, and if you put all of the dollars into treatment, what will end up happening is more and more people are going to continue to get HIV, and so the challenge will grow. So a certain amount of the resource needs to go into the R&D that will help curb and ultimately end the epidemic. And that's why we focus in on two things. We focus in on the prevention side, and we do focus in on treatment efficiency. Now, why do we focus in on treatment efficiency? Because we know that if we can help the world be more efficient in treating all of those people you were describing, that more dollars are available to go into the R&D that's necessary for prevention. And so we very strongly believe that's what needs to happen. And if you begin to have very effective prevention techniques so that then you can start driving down the number of new infections, then ultimately you can change the profile of the curve in the direction that we need. And so we're very excited about some of the work that we're doing. One of the most, I mentioned adult male circumcision, which may seem really strange to many of you, but there's a reasonable percentage of certain populations in the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, that do not practice circumcision of infants or even adolescents. And they're just more subject to HIV. I mean, it's now been, clinical trials have shown that. So adult male circumcision is a very effective technique. But what do you do to give women control of prevention? And so there's been investment in things like female condoms, but that, behavioral change can be difficult. We're very excited about ARV-based microbicides. As there's been some recent clinical trials that have shown great efficacy there. We're very excited about something that's called PrEP, which stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. But it's basically using ARVs with high-risk populations, people who are not infected, but they're taking ARVs to lower their chances of infection. And so these are some of the things that we're experimenting in order to, or researching, I should say, in order to try and make sure that the world has the necessary tools to curb the growth of the epidemic and ultimately begin to reduce it.
Well, by spelling out that picture, one of the things that's clear is that you can't do it alone, which is what you say, and it's right. That involves, it would seem, an enormous amount of collaboration, connection, negotiation with many partners, depending on the issue of the case, governments, other NGOs, international players, UN and UN agencies. That becomes a skill set that you folks have to develop in order to manage and bring down the rate of disease or what have you. Who does that? Do you and a couple of senior people do it, or is it like decentralized? How does this collaboration happen given different cultures, languages, and everything else? Maybe give an example that would be interesting.
Well, let me step back and start with the background, and also then, as part of that, speak to one of my responsibilities as CEO. I try and keep in my mind 7 key things that I think have to get done as the CEO of the Gates Foundation, and the first one of them is to make sure that we have a great leadership team with strong directors for each of our 25 strategy areas. If you get, if you have the right leadership team in place, and this is something people learn in business, that they tend to hire the right people, otherwise they probably weren't the right leader. And so that's a key part of the responsibility that I have. Unfortunately, I've got Phil and Melinda is great support. We have 3 presidents, one for each of the program areas. Think of those as divisions. And they have great expertise in the field. So that's the starting point to make sure that we put in place the right talent and the right kind of collaboration and structure in order to build the kind of collaboration that you described.
Joel's just looking at that.
Yep, got it. Yeah. I was told to expect that.
He's got a very large bag in the flat space. Let me throw one more question at you from a different angle, and then we'll open up to the audience.
Okay.
And it is in a number of places the foundation's been criticized, and you in fact have been very open about it for not being as collaborative or working well with grantees. You commissioned a report by the CBP, Center for Philanthropy. The results were not as good as you wanted them to be. And you said publicly, we need to communicate better, we need to listen better, we need to figure it out better. And this was, years ago, reasonably soon after you began. What have you been doing differently so that you can work better with others, planning stuff out, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, so again, I think this relates a little bit to just the challenge of a fast-growing organization and some of the lack of some of the structural systems and processes that are necessary to succeed. And so the first thing I did actually was to survey the employees, because I wanted to really understand what the employees think. On that list of 7 things that I mentioned, one of them is to make sure that we have a great environment for our employees to do their best work. And so I really wanted to know what they were thinking. And I produced, I assembled a set of priorities that came out of that. Then the following year, so last year, we did the first all-foundation survey of grantees. And these are the active grantees. These are the ones who got money from us. It'll be fascinating to see what the ones think who didn't get money from us. And, you know, in both cases, the employee survey and in the grantee survey, the results weren't what I had hoped that they would be, but they were actually kind of what I expected. I spent a lot of time listening to employees, small groups, large groups, to grantees, you know, one-on-one. I like to ask questions. That's one of the great attributes, or an important attribute that I think I bring to the job. And those surveys mostly just confirmed what my instincts were. And some of it was really, like, for example, in the grantee case, it was really quite obvious. We had some things where our grantees didn't know who their contact was at the foundation. So we said, well, we think they ought to know who their contact is at the foundation. We gave them money. We probably ought to be in touch with them. The orientation of grantees to working with the Gates Foundation, the level of clarity of what our decision-making process is, and where we are in that decision-making process. So there were about 5 of these things which I would call the low-hanging fruit. I mean, there were kind of obvious things that we needed to do better. Everybody had good intentions. It's not that I thought we had bad people or anything like that. In fact, some of the grantees, you know, absolutely would talk about just how great their program officers were. So like any employee population, like in a sales force, you'll have a distribution curve. We had our distribution curve. The smart approach is to listen to what it is that you're doing well on the high end of the curve and figure out how to bring the curve to the right and get everybody doing those things. So there were just some basic things that I think we needed to get done. There are some more systemic things that I think we need to address. And this actually, these priorities largely relate to both our employee work environment and our work with our grantees. One of the number one things I would say is you have to be clear about the engagement model. Are we just funding you and then, hey, thank you, good luck, send us an annual report? Or, on the other end of the spectrum, are we going to be working with you side by side, and we're going to have personnel, Gates Foundation personnel, either stationed there or visiting you on a frequent basis, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, you have, in some respects, you might say, a distribution curve of engagement between you and the grantee. And when I guess it was almost exactly a year ago, I asked our senior-most leadership team, called the Management Committee, at an offsite, I asked them to go through what they thought the engagement model would be for our work. And we have about 25 strategies, and each of them have about, on average, 5 initiatives, and each of them, on average, have a couple of sub-initiatives. So basically, we're looking at about 250 different sub-initiatives in the foundation. And they said the engagement model would probably be different for every one of the sub-initiatives. I said, that doesn't work for me. And so, well, that's exactly the problem. And so it took me a couple of months, but I basically laid down the challenge. And I said that we just can't operate this way. So I want you to figure out what are the 5 or 6 most common approaches that we have. And, it turns out that they then went and did that, and they figured out 5 or 6. I let the 3 different program areas do it. And they had a little bit of variation between the program areas or the divisions, but they kind of ultimately agreed on the 6. And that covers probably 80, 90% or more of our work. But if our employees don't have clarity of what our expectations are of them engaging, how do you think our grantees can be clear about what the expectations are of engaging? So this is just one of those obvious operating model things where it means that the work environment is at the level of quality it needs to be, and it means the grantee relationships aren't at the level of quality. So after the low-hanging fruit, what we really needed to do was to significantly improve our approach when it comes to things like our operating model. And that'll be a work in progress. That won't happen overnight. Some of our weaknesses have been developed over a period of time, and we're just going to have to invest in those things that will help us improve on things like the engagement model.
Okay, we're going to go to our friends and colleagues out here. By the way, shall I leave this task to you, or shall I?
Well, I certainly, one of the things that I do in order to really make sure I raise the level of our game is I read good books. And so today I wanted to promote my latest favorite book. It's called Give Smart. And it's about philanthropy that gets results, because that's what we're really talking about here. And it happens to be written by Joel Fleischman and Tom Tierney. And the camera's over there, so I do want to make sure that I get the book on camera.
This is precisely what we had hoped. He said the right thing.
But in all seriousness, the great thing about this book is very practical approach to what you need to do in order to increase the impact of your philanthropy. There are 6 key questions you need to focus in on. What are your values and beliefs? How do you define success? How are you going to be accountable, or what's the accountability? How will you hold yourself accountable? Do you have the capacity to deliver? What's the grantee relationships, the kind of things that I'm just talking about here, and what are you going to do to continuously learn? How are you going to get better and better and better? And so the thing I think is great about this book is its focus. One of the things that I learned over the years in business, and actually it was a dinner I had with Lou Piniella, who was the manager of the Seattle Mariners. Trish and I are part owners of the Seattle Mariners. And so we root for 2 teams. We root for the Mariners and whoever's playing the Yankees. And I had dinner with Lou Piniella, and one of the things that Lou symbolizes is a characteristic I see commonly in leaders. And that's the ability to take the complexity of the world around them. Like if you're a product manager at Microsoft, you have the complexity of your product, the complexity of the marketplace, and the complexity of the competitive environment. And the best product managers are the ones who are able to take all of that complexity and reduce it down to its essence in the form of what's called a positioning statement. Great leaders have the ability to take the complexity around them and reduce it down to its essence and get people to follow them on what needs to get done. So, in my opinion, the great thing about this book is the same thing that I learned from Lou Piniella. It takes the complexity of all that you can be doing in philanthropy, and it really boils it down to 6 key questions that everybody should be focusing in on in order to have the greatest impact.
And all the net royalties go to charity. Yeah. All the royalties go to charity.
And I get no cut.
Nor do I, nor does Tom. Great. Questions? Okay, let's start right here.
Sure. I'm Robin Furman. I'm with Triangle Community Foundation here in Durham, and I appreciated the comment around distilling things down to their essence. And so I'd love to hear what the other 5 things that you're responsible for are: talent, management, how you think about your 7 areas, talent.
Yeah, it really in some, and it may change over time, but when I started in the job, and frankly with Tom's help, who graciously sits down with me at least once a quarter, I put together this list of the 5 things, or 7 things I really thought the foundation needed to get done in my first 5 years. And I mentioned the importance of leadership. And that also includes having a fairly rigorous evaluation of leadership. And so I would put that there. We've got to have 25, if we're in 25 areas, we've got to have 25 great strategies where we, in a very rigorous, disciplined way, review our execution against those strategies and really learn from them and update our strategies as needed. So we now have those processes in place, and that was part of what Ed was referring to in terms of some of the documents that he was reading. Third thing is I have to have a great environment for our employees to do their best work, and we're not there yet by any means. We'll probably never be there on my scale because I always believe in continuous learning, but we're far from having the kind of environment that I think we need to in order to tap into the talent of our employees. And part of that means we have to have good performance management as well. Third thing, that was third on the list. Fourth thing I think is extremely important is to have great grantee and partner relationships. A lot of people will talk about partnering with their grantees. You'll read about this in the book that Joel and Tom talk about partnering. We have to do much better on what we do with our grantees, but also we have other types of partners, other funders, other thought partners. And so, if you're interested, I'd be glad to come back to the whole issue of partnering and my perceptions of that within the sector and the Gates Foundation, because I've not been super impressed. We also have to make sure that we're clear about our operating model. And so this engagement model that I was talking about, but that also implies resources in the resource strategy. What is the right amount of resource to do what we are doing? Well, if you're not clear about how you want to do it, then you have no idea. I have no idea. Well, no, that's too small. More on things. Should we have 1,000 people? Should we have 5,000 people? To do the work that we do. Well, that comes from being clear about your operating model. And so we really have to do that. Another thing that's extremely important is how you put in place actionable measurement to drive continuous learning. And so this is these proxies for the market system, if you will. And so we have a whole taxonomy of actionable measurement, but the foundation really isn't yet using it, and they're not. We're kind of immature, in my opinion, in terms of how we build measurement, learning, and evaluation. And I'm a big believer in the statement I'm about ready to make, so I wouldn't suggest a lot of notes, but this is one I really believe in. We have to, in our work, we're trying to be innovative because we're taking on really big problems that are super hard to solve. If they were easy to solve, they would have already been solved. So we really have to look for innovation. But innovation implies risk. And so if you're going to take on risk, you're going to fail. You hopefully won't always fail, but you're going to fail sometimes. There is something about the whole structure in philanthropy where people are discouraged from ever failing or even talking about their failures. And I think that's got to change. The problems that we're all collectively trying to solve are too big. And so what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to figure out how we can change the culture of philanthropy to be more articulate about these mistakes and what we should learn from them. So I like to say to people that even if your grants don't fully succeed, your only failure is if you don't learn from them. Okay? Because otherwise, you're going to tune the organization to only make the safe grants that actually won't add up to the innovation necessary to change the world. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to work together to change the world. So, just keep that in mind. And even if your grants don't fully succeed, you only fail if you don't learn from them. And I think if we can inject that as a philosophy of the sector, I think we'll be a lot better off. And so how do you put in place the measurement systems that really drive towards continuous learning, continuous improvement? That's extremely important. Another thing that I think is extremely important is the quote-unquote brand of the foundation. People in the sector tend not to like that term because it feels too private sector-ish, and so they like to use the term reputation. My brand, reputation, whatever it is. But how we use our voice at the foundation and in conjunction with others to shine a spotlight on those needs in the world and then motivate people to invest in those needs and change in the world. That's a very important asset of the foundation. But one that I know from my experience at Microsoft with image and reputation and brand has to be very carefully managed. And so we're in this golden honeymoon period where people really think very highly of the foundation and the work that we're doing, and almost to the point where I'm a little afraid they're too anxious to just want to do whatever we want to do. We need to have a good, rigorous intellectual dialogue about whether that's right or not. We're taking on some problems where we're going to get a lot of pressure. Take our work on U.S. education. That's a lightning rod for controversy. It's easier to eradicate malaria, which will take 40 years, than it is to transform the U.S. education system because it's much more political. Eradicating malaria is not so political. So that's going to put a lot of pressure on our brand, on our image, on our reputation. So I have to make sure that we really figure out how to appropriately use our voice.
I come from the private sector, doing green tech investment. So digging in on this idea of continuous learning and its role in the civic sector as an end game, you talked about how the foundation is like an awkward teenager that needs to develop its muscles. And I imagine that at times in your work at Microsoft, you felt the same thing, that you needed to grow. As you grew, you became a mature, adult, and the end game for that in the...
There's some competitors who would question that.
Well, that's the game, is that we continuously try growing, or we atrophy and die. And in all of the sectors, in the private sector, in the civic sector with foundations that last forever, and in the public sector, programs grow and hopefully become mature, and then either they keep innovating or they atrophy and die. You've got a very different model where as you build your organization and you mature, at some point, you're just going to die. What's the role of your organization in the long term in the civic sector, as a given that you are a spend-down foundation?
Wow, that was a big question. Let me try and play back the essence of what I think you're asking in order to make sure I'm on target. I think you're asking me to reflect upon what's the long-term impact of the Gates Foundation relative to the sector and the
Yes, and specifically in the fact that you're developing 900 or 1,800 leaders in the sector who you're going to put out of a job. And not all of them will end up being, not all your program managers will end up being picked up by Ethiopia to run.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If we narrowly focus in on the personnel part, I actually am not too worried about that. Why? Because most of what we're trying to do is very long term. I was serious when I said that I think it'll take 40 years. The best estimate right now is it'll take 40 years to eradicate malaria. So our malaria team is feeling particularly secure in their jobs. The polio team, we are committed to work with the world to try and eradicate polio, and that's something that's a near-term opportunity. The idea is to try and interrupt transmission in all countries, the 4 remaining endemic countries, by the end of 2012. We hope that the world sticks to that. Maybe it slips into 2013, but we're talking about something that's very near term. All of these folks are great experts in vaccines and delivery and so on and so forth. They're in high demand. So even for something that's relatively near term, and that's probably the most near term completion goal that I can have in any of our work. Now, if we shift our strategy, that is both challenging for our employees and for for our grantees. And those just, you have to manage that well, but typically with plenty of notice. So bottom line is I don't actually view it as a big problem to do the personnel management, but it's a great question.
Hi, I'm Allison Dorsey. I work with Community and Economic Development in Durham. I recently learned about your equity investment in Liquidia, and I don't know if that was the first equity investment in a for-profit biotech company, but taking that step and doing that as a foundation, is that something you're going to continue to do and look for more companies to work with?
Yes. Yeah, and I think yes on both counts. I think yes, it was the first private, first investment that the foundation has made in a for-profit company. Those things are very difficult to do. I know that there's some experts here on regulation of the philanthropy sector, and there are things that we are trying to do that really will do great things for people. And we think our partnership with Liquidia has a tremendous potential. But the regulations really chase most foundations away from wanting to do for-profit investments. And so, at least of this form, which is not a mission-related investment thing, this is a program-related investment. It's PRI. And we actually have set aside about $400 million to do these types of things because we think it could be a breakthrough approach. For example, we did a $30 million bond backstop for I think it was KIP, one of the charter school organizations. Now, what does that mean? We actually don't put out a dime unless they default. But the fact that we provided the backstop meant they were able to get a much lower interest rate on their bonds, and so that's a good thing. And so that's all. We're going to do some debt type investments. We're going to do some equity type investments because we think there's a lot of potential.
And let me just make a quick remark about that these different approaches to philanthropy, besides grant making to an institution, are growing in their uniqueness in some cases, and their diversity, so that grant making has become and is becoming, or philanthropy, becoming much more diverse than just plopping money down as a grant and doing it. And the sophistication and talent needed to do it well and properly is also something you have to marshal and get done.
Yeah, and it's hard in part because the program officers are more used to making grants. And so there's a whole process about grants. But now to use this new instrument, whoa, what do I do with this thing? And actually, it's probably in most cases a better thing for the program because it may mean no expenditure of dollars, but because it's a different type of thing, the program officers naturally shy away from it. So we think we've got some work to do to get our programs to fully exploit these techniques.
I'm Ted Fisk. I'm an education writer. I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about...
I've read that guy.
We're laughing.
You know, the reason I'm on campus today, this is the second priority. First priority is Jillian Raikes is looking at Duke. She's a high school junior, so she'll be reading the guide.
He's got the copy one.
In that form? Or in...
Why didn't you bring a copy of that to the
Now you've seen my skill.
Okay, you're hired. I'm sort of thinking as you were talking about how you go about setting your priorities and then making the course corrections and so forth. And I wonder if you'd talk about that perhaps in relation to one of the more visible Gates education initiative, namely the small schools project. I mean, there you made a pretty substantial bet without a lot of evidence that it would work. I mean, people were saying there isn't a lot of evidence on it. You then made some quite abrupt changes in the program. I'm just wondering, how did that kind of all come about? How does that work?
Yeah, well, the easy thing would be to say that happened before I started. But, no, seriously, it's an important thing for us to learn from. I actually think that the work that we did, or the Gates Foundation did on small schools, was very important in terms of our learning.
Mhm.
I think a key reason why we have shifted to really focus in on teacher effectiveness is because of what we learned in the small schools work. Some of the small school structure work actually showed a lot of success, and some of it didn't. And so then people really tried to dive in and say, well, what was it that distinguished where it worked and where it didn't? And it was really those environments where there was a higher degree of teacher effectiveness. And so then what do you do in order to try and stimulate that? And that then led to the questions of, well, how do you even define teacher effectiveness? And so I don't understand all of how the program got started, but one thing that I always worry about is that people lose sight of the fact that even though that didn't fully succeed, it actually taught us a lot about where we are now focused in on our strategies. Ted, you also asked some made some additional points that are very important too, which is transitioning things like that are not easy. And I think that, and one of the things you're going to read in the book, Give Smart, is that it's extremely important to get clear early on about success and how it is going to be achieved. Because what will end up happening is, and I frankly see this in some of our programs today at the Gates Foundation, financial services for the poor. We thought big opportunity, we put a lot of money out there, some, a little bit in microfinance, some insurance, and then we decided savings was where it's at, and now we're thinking, well, yeah, savings is important, but really, how are you going to get there in an economically feasible way? It's probably digital money, so on and so forth. Bottom line is, we got a lot of grants that are the legacy of those early investments that we made, and so we got a lot that we're going to have to manage as part of the transition. And so that part of the book particularly rang true to me right now because of some of these challenges, and meaning the part that really says, get clear about what success is and how it's going to be achieved. And you'll save yourself a lot of headache down the line. You'll save your grantees a lot of headaches as well. Thanks.
Yes, identify yourself, please.
I'm Anita Brown-Graham. I'm the trustee with the Z. Smith Meadows Foundation here in North Carolina, and I'm also the director of the Institute for Emerging Issues. And I share those two hats because I would very much like to hear you talk about partnering with your grantees, particularly given the significant power differential, whether that's actual or perceived, that exists between the two parties.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, the question is about partnering with grantees, and in particular the power imbalance that occurs, because the grantee to some extent is really incented to say whatever whatever they think you want to hear in order to get the funding, and that's probably an extreme statement that isn't typically true, but there is that power imbalance, and that, by the way, is the subject of another chapter in the Give Smart book, is that very issue. I think you really have to create a culture of learning and partnering. I'm going to say something that will probably shock people, perhaps on two dimensions, but I have found philanthropy to be much less partner-oriented than even incredibly hyper-competitive high-tech. Now, let me illustrate a point. Most people don't understand that Microsoft's success is in large part due to the 750,000 organizations in the world who make a business out of Microsoft's business. Microsoft has more than 750,000 partners. They have companies that are building computers that run Microsoft software. They have little companies down the street that are installing the networks, so on and so forth. So the idea that we had to really care for and nurture those partners and have a very good intellectual dialogue about what was working for them and what wasn't working for them was fundamental to our business success. But coming into the Gates Foundation, I didn't feel like we have that quite as embedded in our DNA the way that I feel like I've seen in other sectors. And that includes even just things like partnering with funders. I find that typically people who are funders don't know what other funders are doing. Yet if you're partnering or competing with Apple Computer, IBM Corporation, Lotus Development, you pay attention to what they're doing. And you potentially, especially if you're partnering, you even have kind of a joint roadmap or blueprint of the future where you have a vision of how you're going to get there. And so, generally speaking, I think the philanthropic sector needs to up its DNA for partnering. And I think that that will spill over in positive ways for the grantee relationships as well. You have to, relative to the grantee relationships and the imbalance of power, you really, really, really have to create a culture of learning and curiosity amongst the program officers, where they really understand the power that they hold and respect it and manage it in an appropriate and proper way. And I always find the best thing to do is to ask questions. What do you really think? How would you think about it differently? I understand you think that we're doing a great job. What are the 3 things you think we really should be doing differently? Those are the kind of questions I like to ask. Because if you ask them, how do you think we're doing? Oh boy, they think we're doing great. But if I really start drilling into asking them, yeah, I understand that, but what are the things that you really think we should consider differently? What's an alternative approach that might work? Then you can start to sift through or break through some of that cultural barrier that will naturally exist because of the imbalance in power.
Well, I think it's very good that you're into taking big risks because this philanthropic work needs to be done, and if you put that on the schedule, I'd like to go at it. We're going to do 2 more, and then we'll that lady back there.
Yes. Welcome. I'm Lynette Schauffer. I'm with the Office of the Governor in Community Service and Volunteerism. And I wanted to address your concern about talent pool and say that if you decide that you might want to open the East Coast office with Gates Foundation, it would be with a very enthusiastic response, I'm sure, and all the help from the Governor to help open such an office.
Great. Thank you.
Sure, I work with BSL in Africa. So
Just introduce yourself.
Excuse me, Caleb Farmer. I'm a joint degree student between here and the business school. I worked with BSL in Africa, the savings group, so I understand what you're doing there.
Okay.
And I'm doing my master's project on mobile banking in Ecuador. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on your mobile money strategy over the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, I should have asked you, do you want me to repeat the questions for the camera? I probably should.
I think we're okay.
Okay, so the just to be safe, the question really is about our thinking about mobile banking and digital money. And it gives me the opportunity to make a broader point. One of the things that people lose sight of is the importance of behavior and behavioral change in the work that we're all trying to do. If you're going to have long-term sustainable impact, mostly what you're going to do is you're going to figure out mechanisms. It's not going to be just because you have the shiny new widget. It's because you're going to have shaped behavior in a way that people want to use the shiny new widget. And one of the misunderstood things about Microsoft is that we succeeded because we bet on technology paradigm shifts, like the shift from character user interface to graphic user interface. That's a classic one that gets discussed. And those were important, but equally important was that at the same time we typically were introducing business model transformations. So, for example, in my work when we were doing Office, we not only bet on graphic user interface, we bet on the Macintosh and Windows for our applications in Office, but we also bet on the idea that you could put them all together in a single package and sell them that way at a time when they were all sold standalone by the competitors. So it was that sweet packaging that transformed the business model at the same time that we were making the bet on the technology paradigm shift. And there are other things that other innovative approaches, but I just want to suggest to all of you that frequently it's business model transformations along with technology paradigm shifts that lead to the greatest areas of growth. Is it because Google figured out search, or is it because Google figured out an online advertising model, which was a business model transformation? It was the combination of those two things. That's really what's most powerful that I've seen in high tech. How does this relate to Caleb's question? It relates because we all need to think about economics. You want to be able to scale and sustain these initiatives, like in this case, things related to mobile banking, so that they're appealing to poor people. What you're going to have to do is you're going to figure out the underlying economics. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out what combination of things are going to dramatically lower the costs for having a banking account. Okay? And today, even the most advanced thinking about branchless banking or agent-based banking, we don't believe yet the economics are yet there, or do we even yet see the path to get the economics there so that the cost of the account is cheap enough that a person that only lives on $1 or $2 per day can afford to have an account. And so that's the thing that we're really working to figure out right now. And digital money may be the bootstrapping mechanism where the digital money basically eliminate the idea of having the currency or using much in the way of currency. So thank you very much.
Good. Now we're going to do one more with Sunny. Introduce yourself, and then we'll close.
So I'm Helen Ladd. I think you decided a faculty member should ask a question. I'm a faculty member here at the Sanford School, and also have to be
At which school?
Sanford School.
Okay.
Right here.
Great.
So I work in the field of education. So I was glad we finally got education on the table here. You mentioned it's a contested area and hard to move. There are lots of reasons it's hard to move. There are complicated projects here. In one sense, it appears as if the Gates is looking for panaceas or silver bullets. So first it was small schools, and now it's teacher effectiveness. That worries some of us in the profession because we looked at education a lot and realized there are lots of complicated issues and questions, some of which might be resolved by changes within the education system, some related to society more generally. So when then Gates comes along with your billions of dollars and puts so much focus on one of these solutions, do you, as CEO of Gates, get concerned that this may lead us in the wrong direction by taking attention away from some of the broader issues related to education policy?
I worry, but I would primarily worry if people thought it was a silver bullet. The work that we're doing on teaching effectiveness, as an example, I think will contribute to a broader set of work that really has to relate to what is the personnel system and the work rules within our K through 12 system. And so I don't think teaching effectiveness in of itself is the silver bullet. And I would worry if people thought that that's what we thought, or if they looked at the work in that way. I think that in order for us to collectively change the U.S. K through 12 system to have greater student outcomes, it's going to involve a number of things. We are trying to work in 4 districts in the United States in a fairly comprehensive way, where it involves not only leveraging the work on teaching effectiveness, but also those districts' thinkings, or their thinking on what needs to happen in terms of their relationship with the teachers' union, which was a part of our grant making. We required that they be working together, what they're going to do in terms of attracting, developing, rewarding talented teachers within their systems, and so in 4 parts of the country, Hillsborough County, Memphis, Tennessee, Pittsburgh, and LA Unified, we have what are called intensive partnership districts, where we're looking at a broader cross-section of the things that could be necessary to achieve greater student outcomes. But no, there is no silver bullet, and I don't even think our work, our broader work, is the silver bullet. I think it's going to be the work that we do with leaders in education, leaders in and other foundations that really help us pull all of this together.
Well, Jeff, if I may, on behalf of our colleagues and friends, thank you very much. This has been a terrific conversation. We're delighted to have you come. We're more delighted to have you stay tonight. Come back. Come back. By that time, this mark will be in its 103rd edition. So on behalf of here, I say thanks really for coming. Jeff is our last participant in the series for this semester, and so we will close and we start again in the fall with a terrific program. I'm sure we'd be delighted to have you come, and this was great sharing everything.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you.